I call adaptation the greatest story never told. I honestly believe adapting to climate change over the next 100, 200, 300 years will be the greatest challenge humanity has ever faced. And I'm talking about wars and stuff too. People, the stuff that's coming and the movement of people and all that, it's a really big deal. There's a lot of great storytelling there, and we just aren't investing in it. If I went out and talked to 100 people just in the street in the mall and I asked them, what do you think climate adaptation is? Maybe 2 would be able to give me a somewhat informed answer. There's so little awareness of this incredibly big issue. And so I think it's just time is ripe for storytelling, and there's a lot of experimentation out there, but we're still not seeing it at the scale.
You're listening to A Climate Change. This is Matt Matern, your host. I've got a great guest on the program, Doug Parsons. Doug is an adaptation expert. He's also a podcast host of America Adapts, the climate change podcast. He's been doing that since 2016. He was North American Policy Director at the Society for Conservation Biology for a while. And welcome to the program, Doug.
Hey, Matt, it's a treat to come on a podcast. It's nice to be on the other side once in a while, but thanks for having me on.
Well, it's great to have you. I was listening to your 200th episode, which you were interviewing a bunch of people from the Department of Defense. And I was curious as to, what has shifted since you did that interview, because there's a new administration. And are those people still working at the Department of Defense on adaptation, or are they have new jobs?
Well, yeah. So I've done 3 episodes with the Department of Defense, but obviously under the previous administration. And so I don't think I'll be doing one with the current administration. Some of those people in that episode were political appointees, so they just leave anyway, just like January 20th, they resign. But it's my understanding, and I was able to have a conversation recently with a national security expert. I asked, what's going on bases? Because I think if you were listening to that episode, a lot of it focused on installations and how they're prepping for the impacts of climate change. And it sounds like a lot of that's still going on. They might just be changing the language, which I know is ridiculous, but I think a lot of that is just because they have to keep these areas protected. They have to be prepared. And so I think a lot of that's still going on. But the reality is, like, it is a bit of a witch hunt when you even have words like climate change. They've had to kind of take even those words out, even if they're doing the exact same thing. So it's a bit of a mixed bag. I think a lot of stuff is still happening, but it's just an unnecessary step back that you shouldn't be doing. We have to be preparing for this, and the military should be preparing for it. So I think that's what's going on right now.
Well, it is kind of an amazing sandbox to test some of these ideas out in, because it is such a enormous organization. It's practically as big as Walmart. So, the U.S. military. But I was kind of just thinking about it, like going back to history, like Winston Churchill. One of the big things he did as Secretary of the Navy before World War I was he changed all the ships of the British Navy from coal-powered to oil-powered. And that was a big change, which, kind of led to the Navy being more effective. I think that's probably similar to what could happen for the U.S. Changing fuel sources could actually lead to a more effective fighting force in a lot of ways.
Yeah, there's a lot of opportunities, I think, for improvement. Another episode I did with the Department of Defense, it was focused on the Pacific Islands. And so we actually have quite a few bases there, and they're very concerned about sea level rise. Some of these bases, like the Marshall Islands, these are 2-3 feet above sea level. And so these are facilities that are likely going to be gone. And so planning for these things, doing these things in advance where you have a little bit of time, this just makes sense. There's this issue of military readiness, and this is all about military readiness. And I think that's a good example of Churchill making that switch. These things might seem like big tasks to do, but the Department of Defense has the resources. Like you said, it's as big as Walmart. I think it's 5th biggest economy in the world if you just look at its budget. So of all the groups out there, there's a lot of groups out there doing adaptation, but this is one that actually has some deep pockets. And so we could do a lot of learning from that. And again, we're going to be taking, probably a pause on that, the DoD being a leader in the space, but just there's huge opportunities there, and they will eventually come back in a big way, and because they'll have to. Climate change isn't going anywhere.
What are some of the things that you saw them doing that was cutting edge or certain or effective during the time that you were interviewing them?
Well, it was interesting. They invited a lot of folks it was in Hawaii where they had this conference. And so the DoD was hosting some folks, and they actually were doing, you wouldn't know it, but the Department of Defense actually does a lot of cultural resource work because they're working with all sorts of countries. And so they have a lot of, I guess, engaging other countries. And so at this conference, they were inviting people to come in, and these were like private companies and such. And they had new technology to think about, extreme heat and, solar and all that. I mean, there was the energy side of it, but a lot of it was the adaptation side of it too. And, someone created this like covering that, you could put around yourself that cools you down, and the applications for cars, applications for just, civilian use, which is amazing. And so the DoD does a lot of research, and I've worked, on another conference where they do science research, and I don't think the public has any clue of all the things that the Department of Defense funds. And these are like private groups, nonprofit groups, and obviously things are going to change when you have new administrations, but some innovative work's happening out there, and they have the pockets to fund this. It's like, will we see this stuff come to fruition? Will we see it? Maybe, but a lot of that is just trial and error right now. And that's the point I like to make on my podcast, is just adaptation is still a relatively new concept. I mean, I'm an old timer. I've been doing this since the early aughts, and you've only really been hearing it in a big way in the last 5-10 years. So it's an emerging area, and there's going to be a lot of trial and error. And if anyone says they have adaptation figured out, then they're no, not yet. But we're in that trial and error stage, and I think the DoD is a great example of like, let's experiment. Let's see what we need out there as the climate changes.
Yeah, I think that clearly having an organization with the pockets to fund some of this stuff is necessary. Like Blue Sky Ideas, the average organization or smaller organizations just can't fund that kind of research. And so clearly, the Department of Defense is large enough to fund it, and also to practice it in scale in all kinds of unusual environments, as you said, from the Marshall Islands to the Arctic and Alaska and down to the deserts and all of these places. They have the real-time opportunities to test everything.
Well, and another area, and again, we're hearing this in the news, is like groups like NOAA and some of these federal agencies that provide weather data. Some of these things are being shut down, and then people in the agricultural sector use that information, and so some of it has been put back up because I think they realized it. I don't think people realize that the Department of Defense, the amount of weather data that they create, and a lot of it is off limits, it's top secret, but some of it is shared. And like you just used an example at Arctic or Antarctic regions, that information that most scientists don't get access to. There's a huge opportunity once some of that information becomes available, because they're still doing it. And what we're seeing now is sort of, I guess, the politicization of even weather information, which is really dumb because we need this for hurricane planning and a lot of things like that. But there are these great resources, and there's these redundancies in the system. So hopefully, as we start getting very serious about adaptation, we have these resources to kind of turn to.
Well, one of the things in the news recently was they're talking about turning off 2 climate satellites that are gathering data up in, the atmosphere. And that seems like crazy. Like, we have 2 working satellites and you're going to just stop getting the data from them. Like, who is that helping? Why?
I don't know if you like how political you want to get. They're really, I mean, this is what they're encountering, like the whole notion of climate change and responding to climate change. They use language like you're just being woke by addressing climate change, which is just ridiculous. And so it makes it, how do you even respond to that? And so those 2 satellites, it's a great example. You know how hard it is to build a satellite and then get it into space, and have it to do what it does? I mean, it's just a tremendous expense and effort. And to just turn them off and not use that information, because it's insanity. Hopefully some people behind the scenes, even the DoD or I don't know, the CIA that might have use for this kind of information behind the scenes will they protect these things. But it truly is a witch hunt on anything like, well, this is climate data that's just going to give those folks, ammunition to try to make their case around climate change. And it's very hard to have those kind of illogical conversations. But you're right. Those are the things that are kind of happening right now. And it's going to leave us kind of ill prepared to do. It was just setting us back. Other countries have this kind of information, but it's just going to set us back for no reason whatsoever.
Well, it's like shift some gears and say, hey, well, maybe we're not going to have too many wins in this current administration on the climate front or the adaptation front. What are the wins that are available for states and localities and where people can do something? And I think that's one of the focuses we want to have in the podcast is do something today. What are things that people can do today to move the needle, even in a small way, just to feel like, hey, we're engaged?
Ooh, all right. It's a lot to unpack there. And so there's actually, the federal government actually hasn't completely given up. You hear that FEMA's in the news and they want to abolish FEMA, but there's actually some legislation, bipartisan legislation that will maybe reform some of these things, will make actually some resources available. But they're talking about flooding. And there's this been a really long effort. There's the National Flood Insurance Program, which is just this illogical program that kind of encourages people to live in the flood zone. And they've been trying to reform in that. There's some really good groups that are trying to get Congress to reform that. And I think there's bipartisan interest in doing that. And so what's the relation to adaptations? Obviously, you're living in the flood zone. If we're going to have more rain events, more flooding, let's create policies that discourage people from living there. And then let's have policies to help people get out of there if they're living there now. And so that's somewhat encouraging news, even on the federal level. But those things are really hard to move. But at the state level, there's a ton happening. At the city level, a ton is happening. Again, it's been politicized. But that being said, like California, we could always look to California. They have a much more integrated approach to it. You could have cities doing adaptation plans. Like, well, that's great. What are you going to do with that? But California's actually passed, I think it's related to, just them, they raised tax revenue. And they were the first state in a real big way, like directing that toward adaptation projects. So much attention, as you probably are aware, goes to mitigation and the energy side, which I do want to make a comment about that. But finally, some states are directing. New York has got a plan that they're helping direct. And a lot of it is just retrofitting. And some of this is just really kind of boring, mundane stuff. But that's what we're going to have to do as we are preparing for all this roller coaster we're about to go on with climate change. And so a lot of that's happening now. It's very encouraging. And the private sector is stepping up in a bigger way. They still have a long ways to go. But my history, I started doing adaptation in Australia in 2003. And it was only the ag sector and the natural resource and the conservation sector that was doing adaptation for 10, 15 years before everyone else out there in society is like, wait a sec, this is going to impact us too. And so through my podcast, I get to talk to a lot of interesting folks, experts, scientists that are doing these things. And a lot is happening out there. I think the biggest problem is that there's not enough awareness in the public. They have no clue what's coming. And I don't mean that in a doom and gloom way. It's the fact that we can do adaptation right now is exciting. That's why I feel I'm on the lucky side. The mitigation, energy, those are bigger tasks. You got to get the whole world involved. And let me just say, we have to, there's this kind of friction, and it doesn't happen as much as it used to. But when you talk about adaptation or resilience, people on the energy side, they get all mad. Well, you're giving up on carbon emissions. And anyone in the adaptation space is like, are you out of your mind? You still have to do that. If you don't get the mitigation side under control, then we won't be able to adapt to the changes that are coming. It's a window now that we can, but if you don't get that, so please do your job. But I'm not trying to distract the government from dealing with energy, but we have to adapt. You hear about wildfire in the news today. You hear about sea level rise, hurricanes that are getting, stronger because of climate change. We have to adapt today, but please keep working on the energy and carbon side of things. I think that's a kind of a misconception that's out there that the adaptation folks are just saying, you can ignore that. No, you can't ignore that. It'll get too hard. So,
yeah, I think that's a great point. And there's a continuum of how poorly we do on mitigation, putting less carbon into the atmosphere, will make our adaptation needs even greater. So we need to do both. So if we do an absolutely terrible job of reducing our carbon output, then our chances of kind of getting adaptation right are going to be even more expensive. It probably it'll be an interesting question to you, and maybe you can't answer it because it's really hard to kind of figure out exactly how bad it could be. But the adaptation cost would be, 10 times higher if we screw up the mitigation side of it.
Well, yes, and I don't follow that closely, but the climate scientists, they have like, okay, if we rise 1 degree Celsius, these things are going to happen. 2 degrees, and so they do actually have a map of that, and I think they go up to like 5, 6, 7, 8 degrees. All right, under this scenario where we don't reduce emissions, we're going to see a 6-degree rise Celsius. That would be catastrophic. Right now they're shooting for 1.5 degrees, and we're going to shoot past that. But they're what they do is they speculate what it's going to mean for water resources, what's going to mean for melting of the ice sheets. And so there is some science, like attribution science, that will tell you like, okay, if our temperatures rise this amount, and then like at 6 degrees, it's just, it's like a free for all. It's just the Earth will really be in a bad spot, and human societies will have a lot of trouble adjusting. Right now, if we're more proactive, it's still going to be, like I said, a roller coaster, but it's more manageable now, and like you said, it's a lot cheaper. And so, whatever the cross adaptation versus mitigation, the more you mitigate, the less you're gonna have to adapt, and that's what we need to be doing right now. And again, with my podcast, and maybe we'll get into the idea of communication and storytelling, but there's so little awareness. The public has no clue what's coming. And I think if they understood, and again, that's not doom and gloom, it's more about just being urgent, being responsible. They would probably hold our politicians much more accountable if they understood how adapting is going to be a big challenge for us.
Well, let's talk about water and adaptation there, and living out here in California. It's something that pretty much everybody has some experience in dealing with droughts and wildfires that result from that. We've taken a lot of measures in California to save water and to recharge the groundwater and all that stuff, but we're still not where we need to be. How do you see, say California on that trajectory of adapting effectively to the water crisis, and what are maybe some big needs that will have to, or big projects that would need to be taken in order to really fully adapt, and what are people not seeing that should be done?
Well, I don't know if you knew, I'm actually in Tucson, Arizona, and so I'm out west too. And we have our water issues, and I think the Colorado River just looms large in both our lives. And Tucson, actually, I came here about 8-9 years ago, and I'm from the East. First time I've lived in the West, and I knew about Western water laws, but when you're here, you realize how ridiculous they are. You first come, first serve. You can buy in the East, it's not like that at all. And it's just more logical and like, okay, of course you can't take all the water upstream. And so there's this very complicated thing. And I discovered that I'm like, I'm in Arizona. I moved to an area with water scarcity, and Tucson has been actually very proactive. And it sounds like, California too, burying the water into the aquifer, and they've really done well. Phoenix, not so well. I mean, they're getting there, they're getting better, and I think they're limiting some of the development. But all of this comes down, and I'm going to hopefully answer your question. And so I feel strongly about this too, is that Phoenix has been very irresponsible. But when it comes to the Colorado River and water use, you always, every 6 months, the New York Times will do an article of Southwest can't keep growing like it's growing. And it's just, agriculture is a huge problem in Arizona, and even, in California. And, you have pecan trees, you have cotton growing in the desert. There are plenty of places back east where they could grow these things, but they do it here because they get access to that water, and they overwhelmingly are the largest users. So to me, an adaptation strategy would be to create water uses that are more sustainable. And that actually, water for cities doesn't use nearly as much as agriculture. And I just think, the media actually tiptoes around that. There's always this sort of like, okay, LA and stuff. Yes, they're using a lot, and you should be very efficient with it. But ag is the tough conversation we need to have. And it's not about just growing food. There are other places where you can grow food. And in Arizona, we grow pistachios in the desert, and they're using so much water. I think Phoenix could grow indefinitely, which I don't want to happen. I don't like Phoenix. And but I think it's complex. And so when it comes to adaptation, part of it is making those tough decisions on water policy laws. But I think there are some technological solutions. I just read a really interesting article on how the desalination technology is getting much better. You hear about a lot of it in the Middle East, and they're just using oil for their energy, but that's not going to be efficient. But now there's much more efficient ways to do it. And I think when they scale that up, I think Southern California, you've got the ocean there, and there are, of course, problems with that. But I don't think people are going to leave California in mass if water really becomes hard to get. They will find ways to get it, but there's trade-offs to that too. And so, maybe there'll be some big projects. But I think technology, there's always it's water is like the new oil, and if it's profitable to find ways to get it there, they're going to do it. And I talk about California a lot on my podcast. I think people who live in California, there might be lamentations of some of the things there, but you guys, my goodness, you lead on so much when it comes to adaptation. I have a lot of listeners there, and they're doing some really cool work. I was recruited to moderate this 4-part series that some of the universities are doing on climate migration and mobility. And I mean, California just has so many experts working on these issues. And so I'm somewhat encouraged that California will be a sort of a role model for, especially with the federal government stepping back. That's how it was during, back in the poor George W. Bush years. California took the lead on a lot of issues, and I think we're going to go back to that.
Well, I think you're probably right on that front, and I do see a lot of encouraging signs and amazing people working on it, which is great. You raise a lot of questions there. One of the things that I like to talk about is that there are just a bunch of farmers down by the border of Mexico and California that are in California, and they get more water than all of Arizona and Utah from the Colorado River, just this small set of farmers. And they're growing alfalfa and things that probably shouldn't be grown in the desert. So it would just be easier to buy them all out than to do a lot of the things that we're doing. And it seems why don't we just do that instead of some of the other craziness?
Well, I'm a bit of you kind of have to be a political junkie, and I always who has political power? What are strong interest groups in certain areas? And I look in Arizona, and we had this big story that kind of it just because it got so much attention, and the Saudi Arabians were growing alfalfa in the Arizona desert, and because they bought it and they had access to the land and all that, and they were able to shut that down. It's my goodness, we're producing alfalfa that's getting sent to Saudi Arabia, and of course they need it, but no, you're not going to do this in Arizona. So that got a lot of attention. But I don't get, as part of the GDP and part of the economics of the state, agriculture still isn't that huge. In California, it's pretty big, but there's a few blocks in Silicon Valley that have more GDP and then all of the ag combined. And I don't understand why they're still so powerful. They don't represent a huge voting block anymore. Farmers represent just a tiny bit. I mean, if you're in Iowa, that's a different story. But Arizona, Phoenix, Tucson, everybody lives in the city and the farm. I don't get how they can be so powerful. But I think they're out west. There's such strong momentum to these water laws that they're hard to break. It's really difficult. I always thought, okay, California, just take control, seize it, do eminent domain. This is, the people getting water is more important than, like you just said, alfalfa farms getting it. And for some reason, they don't do it well. So I don't understand the nuances of the political sway of these groups. But California, not just that, alfalfa, you guys do grow a lot of crops there. Just my goodness, vegetables and all that. That would be hard to replace. And so you got to be a bit more thoughtful. But they've talked about if we open Cuba, the amount of vegetables and agriculture that could be produced there would just be a huge, things can be moved around and grown and such. And it's just, I think it's momentum that keeps a lot of progress from happening.
Right. And, the good news there is that in an instant, we could just stop the water flow to those farms and lose nothing in terms of crops that we could survive very easily without that little chunk of, area in Southern California producing crops. And it would provide a tremendous amount of water for people to to drink. So that's good, in that we have kind of an ace in the hole that we could always play and say, okay, enough is enough. You farmers, will pay you off and you'll get a fair return. You'll become all billionaires, but you're going to stop getting all the water. Let's take a little bit of a turn and tell us, what are the main projects that you think are most important in the adaptation space, and what's happening on those fronts?
Well, bigger projects, and this is, again, some of the mundaneness, but a lot of money, there was the big Infrastructure Act, and a lot of money that's still going to go out there. And so when you start talking about building bridges and roads and all those sort of big infrastructure projects, they're starting to think about climate change and sea level rise. And so for the longest time, adaptation planning that's all it was planning. It's like, all right, great. You've got an adaptation plan. What does that mean? Are you spending any dollars? And, are you going, all the recommendations that come out of that process, is anything happening? And finally, we started to see some money, come out. That's like, all right, what does actual adaptation on the ground look like? And foundations they're innovators, and they're leading. Like, you look at some of the projects that they're funding, they might be really micro scale projects, but like I said before, we're in this trial and error phase. And so there's a lot of interest in nature-based approaches to adaptation, which of course I support. It's like, all right, build a concrete wall, or maybe we restore mangrove forests when it comes to, coastal Florida. And obviously mangroves are the way to go because it have so many additional benefits. And I was going to bring this up earlier, but there's something called maladaptation. So let's say, all right, well, sea level rise, we're going to have 3 feet of sea level rise. Let's put a 10-foot wall there. Well, okay, that's adaptation to that sea level rise. But what happens to the water against that wall? Well, it has to go somewhere, and it eventually might affect other parts of the coast. And so maladaptation is just like, you're doing some adaptation work, but it actually has these negative effects. And so, the nature-based approaches are trying to factor that in. Nature-based approaches don't always, scale up in ways that, if you're the Army Corps of Engineers and you're doing levees and all that, it's not necessarily as easy to, let's say, restore a forest to serve as a buffer to flooding, like on the Mississippi. That would be ideal. Sometimes you have to do these big engineering projects, but I think there's a lot of learning going on, and there's a lot of thoughtful people that are thinking about these things now. How can we do this better? But my concern is, over the next 5, 10, 15 years, if climate change impacts really get out of hand in a way that's like, a hurricane is probably a great example of something getting out of hand. It's like, you have no control over the hurricane. I grew up in Florida. I'm a Floridian. Hurricane. It's just like, all right, you just have to be prepared. You have housing codes and all that, but just not much you have control over. But other areas, it's not as extreme, but it could get more extreme. Wildfires could get more extreme. Flooding could get more extreme. And so we have a window here to be really thoughtful about some of these approaches. But, if after a certain while, then they probably are going to try to have engineering solutions to everything. New York City, everybody remembers Hurricane Sandy. That was just catastrophic for New Jersey and New York. And so they're going to be doing a lot of engineering. There's even talk of putting a big wall out in the harbor there. And there's all sorts of problems associated with that. So right now, there's just such a mix of people doing it. And the federal government was trying to get there. They're in the last couple of years of the Biden administration, they had a national resilience framework where they're trying to create some overall national structure to these things. It was a pretty weak plan, and it left a lot of things out, but at least it was an attempt. Most countries, I think there's only 2 or 3, have a national adaptation plan. And this is, for developing countries, this is actually kind of required. But that is sort of this overriding way of thinking about how we're going to adapt to climate change. And it's really just a useful exercise. The United States sort of created one the last few days of Biden administration. They filed it with the State Department, filed it with the UN. So it's technically there, but, the Trump folks immediately came in and said, okay, well, we're not going to do that. But the goal was to file it. So it's there, but we're not adhering to it in any way. That might sound like a bureaucratic exercise to do such a thing, but you'd be surprised. There's just so much happening here and there to have sort of an overall structure has value. It's just you're being more strategic in it, and we need a lot more of that.
Well, one of the things that you bring up is Florida, and I just read an article about some Republicans saying, hey, one of the reasons they have won Florida in the last few elections was that Republicans were going green and pulling in some environmental voters into their ranks. And to me, it sounded like a bit of a fantasy in that clearly nationally, the Republican Party has been pretty anti environment over the last two administrations. So is this just kind of, are they doing things locally that are drawing voters in, or is it just a mirage, what this person is talking about in Florida?
It's a, you're not going to like this answer. It's a combination of both. And grew up in Florida. I lived there when I was adult for a while. And I actually worked for the state government when Charlie Crist was governor. And I was there when the change over to, he's a senator now, Rick Scott. And I was the first climate change coordinator the state had ever seen. And so I kind of created the position from scratch working for the agency. And so we were doing all these great things. And overnight, Rick Scott shut it down. You couldn't even mention climate change. Rick DeSantis is sort of in that same vein, but they can't help because all the cities are like, well, we've got a plan for extreme storm events. We got a plan, for sea level rise. And the only silver lining in like climate change being bad is like, it's not going away. It's only getting worse. And we're seeing that. And you have to react in some way. And so Florida, they banned the use of climate change, but adaptation actually has kind of survived. They haven't really put too much thought into it. And so, we're trying to make this community more resilient. That's okay. And so there's some sea level rise planning going on in Florida. And to Florida's credit, and this goes back to the 80s and 90s, they have an incredible conservation land buying plan. So there's actually, if you look at Florida, the Everglades, and there's just a lot of parks, and that's really important. So you have, Florida's gotten very Republican, but they still like their beaches. They still like their green areas. And so I think a lot of Republicans there, but like on the big issues, yeah, the Republicans aren't doing the things that are making it easier, but they are the biggest issues. They are doing nothing to really discourage development. Like you go to Miami and and they're never going to admit that. And probably a lot of Democrats won't want to admit that too, but you just can't have people moving into Florida. Like just even some of the modest projections now are 3, 4, or 5 feet of sea level rise. And what people don't understand is like, well, they'll just build a seawall around Miami. And it's just, and they are pumping water now. They'll have bigger and bigger pumping projects, but the land underneath Florida is limestone. And so you build a wall, it's just going to go under and then it's going to go around. And so I talk about Florida a lot of my podcasts. And again, I don't try to get too doom and gloom, but it's just like, I'm sorry, guys. This notion of, the term managed retreat is like, all right, going to have to think about leaving this area. They are still encouraging people to move to Florida because they tie up like their tax base and they tie up, just growth with more people, and they have to decouple that. And no one's prepared to have that tough conversation yet. So,
well, I guess there's a couple of questions arise on that front. One is insurance. And to me, I think insurance may be one of the big drivers in waking people up to the challenges of climate change, because, there are actuaries doing the hard analysis and essentially as to cost of adaptation and the cost of hurricanes and so on and so forth. And they're saying, hey, we need more money. And that is hitting people hard in their pocketbooks to say, hey, this stuff is real and it's going to be expensive. The other thing is, when are we looking at 3 to 4 feet of sea level rise? I just read something recently that the sea level rise since about 100 years ago is about a foot. So are we looking at a century, 2 centuries? What's the projection on that?
I think the most recent projections are like 3 or 4 feet by, within the end of the century. But the problem with that, like the number you just quoted, like a foot. And so like what you see is, this is how what they're seeing now is you see these gradual increases in sea level, right? They're like this, but then you go back 40 years, it's like that. And if you go back 30 years, it's like that. And so every year it starts to accelerate. It's still not in huge volumes, but that in itself is one of the hardest things to communicate. Like you tell someone, well, by 2100, this is going to happen. People are mentally going to check out. I mean, a responsible society would plan for that. And the Europeans, the Dutch, because they're on the water, they have like a 1 in 10,000 year flood, like seawall. I mean, they're planning for the future, but it's hard to explain because I see people instantly, even when you say 2050, by 2050, we're going to have this many more hurricanes. that means nothing to most people. And that's been a challenge within communication circles. How do we resonate today with folks? And, you hate to say it, but like you point to, the Palisades fire and California and all the wildfire that's happening right now. This is your future too. And I'm glad you brought up insurance. I'm increasingly covering it on the pod. I just had a huge insurance episode. I had like 10 guests. I had some insurance companies on. I had just some, policy experts and just talking about it. And I had actually a small insurance company CEO come on and talk about what they're doing in Florida. It was a chance for him to share, but it's like they're arranging, chair on the deck of the Titanic. It's like, oh, okay, well, we got this insurance, but they keep going out of business. They have a state insurance fund that was never supposed to be really used much, and it's increasingly just used because no insurance company in their right mind will want to be in Florida. Like all the big ones have left, and I find myself on my podcast like being very sympathetic to the giant insurance. I can't believe I'm kind of shilling for them, but I'm like, well, why should they have to insure? And then California is a big issue too. You guys still allow a lot of growth in the fire zones, wildfire zones. And like, why should any insurance company have to do it? And they're kind of bullied by the state because insurance is regulated at the state level. They're kind of bullied you. Well, you have to provide this much coverage if you want access to these markets. And I think the insurance companies, they're going to be the leading driver of like some serious like adaptation planning, just merely because it's a profit-driven enterprise. And I'm not trying to make them out to be angels and the responsible ones. They're still encouraging a lot of like bad behavior. But look to the insurance markets to see how states are kind of responding and doing their own adaptation planning. Because in Florida, I have family still in Florida. My son goes to college in Florida, and that it's only going to get more expensive. And the notion, like, again, 3, 4, 5 feet of sea level rise, it'll be gradual. It's not going to be like, okay, 2,100, 4 feet. It'll be gradual, and storms events will be worse. And it's just, you're going to see this entropy along the coast. Like, well, this area, we can't really, pump out and all that. And so I think it's the economics of the region are going to slowly just deteriorate. It won't be like that. So.
Yeah, well, I hear that it's quite hard to get insurance in someplace in Florida, and we've seen the building collapses and stuff like that, and of course it's harder to get insurance in California in certain areas because of the fires. So in part, that's like sending the right signal to people to wake up, and I think that's why I'm encouraged. Not because I want everybody, including myself, to pay more insurance. No. But I do want people to wake up, and that is, sometimes hitting people in the pocketbook is the hardest hit and the biggest wake up call to humans. So hey, if that's what it takes, that's what it takes to save humanity. Is insurance premiums going through the roof? Well, then I'll take it because we need it. I'll ask you one other question. Maybe you can hit both of them at the same time. Is in California we've got these wildfires, and Trump has consistently kind of hammered Newsom for not cutting down enough trees or managing the forest well enough. I kind of feel like maybe there's a grain of truth in that, but though the climate change problems and the heat are probably much more at cause than forest management. But curious to get your thoughts on that as well.
Yeah, that just goes back to some old horrible practices, like when they cut the forest down and when they replanted, they just right next to one. These forests are thicker than they ever would have been if they were natural forests. And so there is some truth that, okay, then a fire comes through, it has just a lot more fuel than it normally would have, because fire is just a natural part of the system there. But when you have, instead of 3 trees in a given area, you have 15, it's going to explode. And so the problem with Trump's approach is like, he'd just be happy enough for let the lumber companies come down and just cut it all. Whereas a thoughtful approach would be like, all right, thinning. And they do thinning in different parts of the country and some of the national forests. And that's it's a more thoughtful way, more ecologically sound. There's a rational approach to do forest management. But if one side of it is just like, you need to cut the forest down, that's not someone who's being thoughtful about the dynamics of that forest too. And when you just kind of clear cut things too, it's horrible for runoff, creates its own problems in that way. And so, yeah, you're absolutely right. There's a kernel of truth to like, there's just too much fuel in a lot of those forests, but there's very thoughtful ways to address that. And some places are trying to do that.
I guess, I look at it when I drive through the forested areas in California and think, well, this is a gargantuan job. I mean, this would take tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of workers to manage the forest areas that we have in California. It's just a ginormous area.
Well, yes. And yeah, I mean, you'd be surprised if I don't think people realize when they drive around the United States, New England, all that, all these forested areas, like there's only 5% of like virgin forest left in the United States. And so even though we have so much tree cover, all that has, those were trees that were cut down. And so we have a really effective way to impact large landscapes like that. So I think we could manage it. And there's actually a role for wildfire, even in these overrun forests. There's controlled burns, and you have to be very careful with that. And so that would be an easy, like using less, people to actually manage larger areas. But again, you need thoughtful, you need the right scientists behind it, the right seasons and all that. And so, I think we could actually manage more land than you realize. It's just, it just takes some resources and just being thoughtful about it.
Yeah, it's not like it's beyond our control, but it does require some serious, allocation of resources, and we could do it, and it's worth doing. I'm not saying that it's not worth doing. It's just that I don't see it really getting done at scale of probably what we need to, given the risks that we're facing.
Yeah. And I think some environmental groups, and that's my background, conservation groups, are just guilty of like, all right, no cutting anywhere. And it's just like, some forests need to be managed, because that forest you think is a natural forest is not a natural forest. It's not. And in fact, it's going to be better for a lot of the wildlife if you manage it in a different way. So yeah, there's opportunities there.
Well, let's shift over to the role of public engagement and storytelling in adaptation, and how storytelling can increase community engagement and catalyze climate adaptation efforts. What are your thoughts on that? To move from gloom and doom to empowering stories that inspire action and bring people together for long-term resilience.
Well, in a very loose way, I'm kind of on the, like I said earlier, I think on the better side. The adaptation story is a much more positive one. There's things that we could do today, actual concrete actions. Because when you say reduce your carbon footprint, and that's going to have an impact over the next fight, people just lose interest in it. Whereas here, we need to, get rid of this dam to restore this forest that'll help with flood control. Those are really concrete things that you can do today. And so the storytelling is there. It's ripe. It's just unfocused. And where are you based, though, in California? Where are you?
I'm in Venice Beach.
Okay, but you're in the LA, Los Angeles. So I've been increasingly saying this. I've been kind of obsessed with storytelling. And what happens in the environmental space and conservation space and a lot of science grants is that you'll get a big grant. And then they're supposed to, like, how are you going to communicate the results of what you just did here? This was important work. And a lot of times it's this tag on 5% of the total budget. Okay, you got to go communicate and, demonstrate some value to this. And most of the people involved with it don't even have any communication skills, no communication background. They might create a white paper with that. And so I have my podcast. I like to think I'm a storyteller, but I'm sort of encouraging it. You look at Hollywood just there in your backyard and talk about storytellers, right? They've been storytelling for a long time. And when they make a movie, they might spend $100 million on a movie, right? Maybe one of these big, dumb Marvel movies. And they'll spend $100 million. And I go see this with my children. But then what happens? They spend $100 million marketing it and promoting it, because if they're going to really make the money back on that, they got to create some awareness out there. And sometimes those movies still crater, they fail, but they still spend a lot of money marketing. And that's what I'm arguing, like when it comes into the adaptation space and a lot of these stories, it is barely just a throwaway amount that they're not investing in the sort of awareness that we need to do. I do this presentation when I go to conferences and stuff. I call adaptation the greatest story never told. I mean, I honestly believe adapting to climate change over the next 100, 200, 300 years will be the greatest challenge humanity has ever faced. And I'm talking about wars and stuff too. People, the stuff that's coming and the movement of people and all that, it's a really big deal. There's a lot of great storytelling there, and we just aren't investing in it. President Biden, one of my criticisms, because I knew a lot of people, a lot of listeners in the federal government listen to my podcast, they never created a national communication adaptation plan. You need, again, that sort of broader strategic approach, and no one's doing that. The foundations aren't really doing that. The public, if I went out and talked to 100 people just in the street in the mall, and I asked them, what do you think climate adaptation is? Maybe 2 would be able to give me a somewhat informed answer. There's so little awareness of this incredibly big issue. And so I think it's just time is ripe for storytelling, and there's a lot of experimentation out there, but we're still not seeing it at scale. And so that's not necessarily good news. But at the same time, I also encourage people in adaptation, and be it not just in the storytelling, but we're such early days in this, that you can come into this field and actually have an influence. You can do something innovative and new. How often can you say that about a field? Like these more mature fields of architecture and all that, these things have been around forever. Adaptation is just a baby, and you can come in and actually do something and influence this space in a really big way. I think that's very exciting. And I have a lot of young people that listen, college age, and they reach out and they say, I'm looking at getting a job in adaptation. And the sky is the limit, even though with this looming issue of climate change. I think that's very exciting. And I think that, again, there's some more stories to tell there. Threading them all together is a challenge. And then back to that issue of like, okay, some of these things are going to happen by 2100. That is really a tough nut to crack, to kind of create that awareness and urgency based on using language. And scientists are horrible communicators. They're just terrible. And they're just doing their job, though. I'm not. You can't expect them to be good communicators, and that's part of the problem. Is like, if the scientist has communicated better, and I kind of like to flip that around. It's like, well, okay, that communicator, why don't you just teach him or her to be a rocket scientist too? And it's like, no, you don't. It doesn't work that way. That's a real skill set, and it's a real skill set to be a good communicator. And I think we need to just invest more and take it a lot more seriously.
Well, that's a great point, and I've certainly had some amazing scientists on the show, and some of them I've coached a little bit and said, hey, you've got a great message, and you should probably hone that communication skill because, and I recall one of them really taking heart to it, and I appreciate.
No, that's great.
Yep, yeah. Of like, hey, I recognize that's a weak spot, and I want to work on it, and it's challenging because, hey, she's a brilliant scientist and run rings around me, but she could use some help in communicating the story. I mean, at a federal level, we saw in the last election, Kamala Harris in the debates and with Trump, she really didn't hit climate at all head on. She didn't have a good story. She was afraid that it wasn't polling well. And in part, it was polling poorly because nobody's communicating about it effectively. So, of course, if you're not out in front, if you're not leading, then somebody else will, and telling a story that's not the story you want to be telling.
I hate to get any lessons from Donald Trump, but to his credit, and that's why I think he succeeds with his voters that he does, is like when he says something, and most of the time you think he means it, even though most of the time it's a lie. I mean, there's such easy things to prove, but the way he says it and the confidence, and that's the problem with scientists and a lot of Democratic politicians, is that we do nuance, right? We qualify things. And that's how I want to be spoken to too. I get it. But the vast majority of the public, they just want you being confident. So someone like, a presidential candidate should come out and say, climate change is happening. Of course it is. And we got to respond to it. None of this nuance. And even scientists need to get a bit more comfortable. Maybe they put their necks out. Okay, this might not be well, there's 65%. No, just say 5 feet of sea level rise is our future. And I mean, when you publish, they'll correct you there. But when you're talking to the public, just be a little bit more confident with what you're saying there, because that nuance that a lot of us like to hear, the public doesn't. They just want to sense that you're confident in what you're saying. And that's, I guess, to Donald Trump. He's very confident in those lies that he said. He just really believes them, and they believe him back because they don't have the time or interest to really explore the issue. So.
Right. It takes a lot of time to drill down into these things. I recall getting the IPCC report, and, it's like a foot thick or something, and thinking, how is the average voter going to know about this or to have drill down into it in any meaningful way, it's dense, and it takes like years of study before you really maybe have any degree of mastery, and it covers so many different areas. You really need somebody to distill it for you and to communicate it in a really effective way.
And confident way. I mean, just confidence. And I had mentioned this. Biden released his national resilience framework like the year and a half before his admin was over. Listen to that. I mean, national resilience framework. Could that just be a more impenetrable? No one knows what the hell. I mean, just like, who are the messaging people? I mean, when the next White House administration, they need to hire some really top Hollywood people. National resilience, and it was a big deal among people like me. I mean, my background is policy. They're all the policy wonks, always all so excited. I'm just like, I'm sorry. No one else has any clue what this is. And even though it had these huge repercussions, resilience across the United States and rivers and cities and national, it's like, it's just horrible. I've been criticizing that on the podcast quite a bit. You know, I'm just like, who I'm trying to find out who actually came up with that name. I just want to be like, I want to get them on the show. What were you thinking? You know, so we'll see.
So tell us about how you see the role of private sector in driving climate adaptation. Are there any examples of businesses kind of leading the charge on this one?
Well, we talked a bit about insurance, so I don't need to go over that again. I think like big pocketed folks, insurance will be leading when it comes to like driving some adaptation planning. But there's actually, this is relatively new in the last 2 or 3 years. Like, you know, they call it financial tech. And so there's a lot of technology companies, startups that are coming into this space, which is very exciting for me. I haven't covered it that much on the podcast because, you know, it just, but I've got a new tool that will filter air more effectively. And they're doing it because there's going to be a lot more wildfire in our futures. And there's this sort of water filtration unit and things that you just think are these mundane are actually being developed and being pitched by these companies in response to climate change. And I think that's very exciting. And a lot of startup money is looking for money. And I'm just pulling this number, I'm trying to make a point. Like someone did a sort of an adaptation, like lay of the land, and the sort of investment money that goes into mitigation projects, you know, solar, batteries and stuff. I mean, it's like 80, 90% of all that sort of investor money. Adaptation resilience was getting something like 5%. That will change. And when that starts to change, we're going to really see a lot more exciting things happening. And again, we are adapting to climate change right now. It's not going away. So you'll see more of it. But the private sector, and I think that this is a generational thing too. A lot of those folks in those companies are relatively young. I went to a conference and someone's like 30 and they've already done the startup and they've got these things going on with these projects and this technology that will help with climate change. And I think they have just been raised on climate change is out there and they want to be part of the solution, which is kind of, I think a lot of these problems that we have, we're just dealing with the old guard that just kind of shrugging at the issue. And pretty soon we're going to have like so many people are like, well, this is just standard. And, you know, in Europe, climate change is being addressed in a really good way. So I'm encouraged by that. And on the financial and the tech side, a lot of things are happening. And those guys are kind of communicating with each other. And there's some conferences that are happening where these people are kind of coming together because adaptation for the longest time was just the natural resource sector. So yeah, private sector is coming in a big way, but we're just scratching the surface. Even those people would say, we need a lot more investment.
What about, say, crisis in Africa that could occur or are occurring in real time that are climate related, that we have failed to adapt and are maybe huge adaptation challenges that are likely to be faced in the coming years? So what are the challenges? What are they looking at? I mean, like they talk about in Northern Africa, if there's a big drought there, 400 million people could be kind of on the move, maybe going towards Europe, going to other place in Africa, causing huge amounts of disruption, considering 400 million people could disrupt just about anything. So,
well, no, I get your point there. And Syria was in the news a lot. You know, it's been a little while. I mean, they just recently, because they finally got rid of the dictator there, but that there was a lot of movement of Syrians into Europe that created all sorts of disruptions. And a lot of people don't realize that had to do with drought, access to water. And, national security experts have attributed that to climate change. You're seeing this sort of movement of people and disruption of the other societies based on climate change. That was just a test run of a lot of things that are happening. People are saying that large parts of the Middle East are going to be uninhabitable. Where are those people going to go? And those will take years, and but when they start moving, that's going to create disruptions. And so, planning ahead and the challenges of that. I mean, adaptation here just seems so quaint compared to maybe some of the struggles that they have over in Africa. I actually got to go to Africa a couple times, went to conferences, and it was like I was coming from the airport at 1 a.m. in this van. I was sharing it with a couple of the other conference participants. This woman from Mali, and we were talking about, what were some of the issues in her country. She's like, well, last year, something like, 2 million people were a threat of, lack of water, all that. And I'm sitting there, 2 million people, and they don't have enough water. And these are the sort of the big issues that they're dealing with we might, in the United States, we never have such an issue, like if a storm kills 100 people, which is a tragedy, that's a big deal. They're just dealing with much macro scale, and just wakes you up to the fact that if these places really become unstable, they're going to start moving around. And it's probably been 7 or 8 years, but every 2 years, there's a giant adaptation conference. This year's going to be in New Zealand, and I want to go to that. And the one was in Cape Town, Africa, and like up till maybe 3 or 4 months, it was in the news that Cape Town is going to run out of water. And so this they were actually, I know some people who were Wildlife Fund, they almost didn't go because of the lack of water. And I think ultimately they were able to do it. And so it's just like this real time climate change impact. And it's just, those countries are actually thinking about adaptation, and they're working with a lot of international aid groups. And that's why we just gutted USAID, and they were doing a lot of climate adaptation programs with some of these countries, just really developing countries, and that's gone. Europe still does a lot, but having those larger conversations of like, how are you going to change agriculture? How are you going to sort of, again, adapt your country to kind of survive these changes that are likely coming?
Yeah, it's fascinating. Well, I guess there'll be opportunities to, work on these technologies, because people are going to be having these problems in real time. And so we're going to have to solve for them. One bright spot that I saw was you had mentioned Saudi Arabia earlier, and just the Middle East being potentially uninhabitable. And one of the things that they're doing is they're putting up a huge amount of solar there to power their country, and I guess desalination, as well as all kinds of other things, which, as you had referenced, they had previously done with burning oil to create the energy to desalinate. Now they're going to do it through solar, which is obviously a better source. And the downside is they're going to be able to sell that oil to somebody else. But so they're doing it partly out of economic reasons. But they kind of see the writing on the wall maybe better than we see it in the U.S. When I went to COP28, Dubai and the UAE and Saudi Arabia and all those countries were investing pretty heavily into the energy transition. So they seem to get it. I mean, it's now a weird place that Saudi Arabia is now more environmentally proactive than the U.S. government.
Yeah, it's true. I was actually having this conversation earlier this morning with a friend, and I know I'm not the energy expert, but like you look what China's doing with EVs, and like they're like the source of most solar panels around the world. They look at renewable energy as almost like oil in the ground. Like they are becoming a strategic resource in their ability to do that. So I'm very encouraged by that. And I think you're going to see a major dip in oil demand just when the EV revolution truly takes off. And then it's just like and you're going to have oil companies saying, well, we're not going to invest all this money into a diminishing returns. We haven't quite hit that yet. And then again, the tragedy, what's happening in the United States is like, Trump is knocking on wind and solar, and that's our future. It's just, we're going to take a nice 5-10 year pause in it for absolutely no reason. But all these other countries, Saudi Arabia, China, as you had mentioned, it's just, they see this as sort of, it's a national security strategic sort of asset that they're doing. And I don't think enough Americans appreciate renewable energy. You have to look at it as like oil in the ground, a source of economic returns and just strategic value. So I'm encouraged by that, but at the same time, not what country we're in. We're going to be left behind in that respect.
Yeah, it's clearly myopic, and one of the things I've always said about Trump is he masters in myopic thinking, and he will talk about, hey, we want to drill for all this oil because it's a resource, but he doesn't think about, well, the sun is a resource too, and we can get energy from the sun that's cheaper than getting gas from the ground. Well, we should use it. It's just cost effective. But I think eventually the market's going to win this battle, and it's cheaper to get solar energy and wind energy. So it's ultimately going to win. So that's somewhat fueling my optimism.
We're going to be having, stuck with a lot more gas-powered cars in the future. Meanwhile, the rest of the world is only going to be producing like EV cars. And that is going to, I think, blow up in our faces in a really awful way. I think the price of gas, kind of reverse, will probably go through the roof because a lot of oil, I'm talking 10, 20, 30 years from now, they're not going to be drilling anymore because they'll see the rest of the world. I mean, we'll always have needs for some oil, but the U.S. will just be stuck with these outdated vehicles if we don't really make that transition to EV. And so it's just so many ways that's going to blow up in our faces because the rest of the world is doing it. They're going to do it.
Yeah, I saw recently that one country has essentially banned the sale of gas-powered cars and is only doing EVs, and because strategically that makes sense for them, and I think that they're ahead of the curve. And I kind of feel like, well, we're eventually going to have to be going in that direction. It is us being this internal combustion engine island is not going to work, and it's doomed to failure, which is similar to most of Trump's ideas.
I feel like I have a plug-in hybrid. And so for 31 miles, I get just EV power. And if we could just require every person of driving age to drive an electric vehicle for, 5 miles, they'll be convinced. They'll be like, wait a sec, this power and just this, everything about it. I mean, people who have them love them. They're obsessed with them, And so they act like it's, oh, well, you're going to be forced into, it's like, oh my gosh, once you get it, you're never going to go back. They're starting to do EV, big trucks, like tractor trailer trucks. And some of the truck drivers are just like, oh my God, I never want to go back to the diesel or whatever. It's just so much better. And yeah, it's such a dumb kind of thing that we're embracing. So,
well, hopefully, people will get the message, and there are greater sales of EVs year over year, and so I think people are making the change regardless of what is being said at the top of the food chain. But Doug, great conversation, great having you on the show. I appreciate all the work that you're doing in this adaptation space, and I think it's a really great point that you make that it's the greatest story never told, and for communicators and young people to get into the space and be a part of an important area, which obviously we're all going to need over the coming centuries. So being on the cutting edge of that is important work. So thank you for doing that.
Yeah, and thank you, Matt, fellow podcaster. I appreciate what you're doing, and having a platform for all these interesting, important people doing the climate work that they're doing. Yeah. Thanks to you, and thanks for having me on the podcast.
Yeah, and everybody check out Doug's podcast. He's at America Adapts, the Climate Change Podcast, and follow him and all of his social media and all of that. You get a lot of great info and intel into this, and go out there and do something today. Everybody take some action. And Doug, I'll let you kind of answer that question on, as to things that people can do to plug in to this. And I guess Cesar Chavez said, hey, what can you spend on? Because every dollar that you spend is a vote as well.
Well, with adaptation, a lot of that has to do with planning, but what you can do is just find out what's your community, what are sort of the climate threats in your community. And like most cities actually have that kind of information. Just take an interest in that. And then again, this is not as satisfying, but support politicians that actually take this seriously, because these things are macro level issues, even at the city level. But at the micro level, there are things you can do, like in Florida, you can stormproof your homes. In California, people are increasingly thinking of how you the design and construction of your houses when you think about wildfire. And some of this is probably going to be regulated, but there are things that you can do at the micro scale to make yourself more, I guess, resilient to some of these climate change that are happening. But a lot of this stuff is community led, and maybe there's some local groups that you could join or support, because you need to have this kind of broader conversation. And I just educate yourself on this. We still have a long way to go, and we're just going to need public support on this. But yeah, having the right people in the right places helping make these decisions is just critical.
Absolutely. So thank you again, Doug, for being on the show, and wishing you well, and certainly look forward to collaborating with you in years to come.
Awesome. Thanks, Matt.